Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to submit the slide deck that Admiral Gallaudet presented to the Department of Commerce leadership last month into the record. And I'm also
Without objection.
Thank you. And also like to submit a draft released last month by the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy entitled Science and Technology for America's Oceans, a Decadal Vision.
Without objection.
And I do that so that we can all have context for what I'm about to discuss. In your presentation to the departmental leadership last month, you proposed that the NOAA mission statement and vision either be amended or otherwise reconsidered. And specifically, the presentation included two columns, one labeled past and one labeled present. The past column included references to studying climate in order to realize resilient ecosystems, communities, and economies. The present column does not even use the words climate or resilience. And I think both of these are very important priorities for NOAA. In the Great Lakes, higher than average temperatures and a less predictable climate have the potential to shorten the season for recreational activities, increase the rate and severity of storm and flooding events, and we've seen some enormous extreme events of late, impact shipping routes, threaten certain cold water species, and impact our agriculture, tourism, and maritime industries. Admiral Gallaudet, you said in response that, and I quote, "This presentation is a simplified draft for discussion. It was not intended to create change in the NOAA mission or policy from what it was before," end quote. So what then do these columns, past and present, aim to represent, and why are they labeled past and present?
Thanks for your question, Senator Baldwin. The presentation was deliberative. It had not been cleared through the department, and the purpose of the slide deck and the slides you're talking about in terms of mission were merely to foster discussion on how NOAA is aligning under the department's strategic plan. And so there were elements like aquaculture and weather forecasting, which were singularly present in the strategic plan, and that was the purpose behind the language.
The Decadal Ocean Vision document that I also entered into the record identifies goals to advance U.S. ocean science over the next 10 years. Remarkably, even though citations that include titles of study in the footnotes throughout the document use the term climate change, the plan itself never once uses the phrase. How does NOAA intend and plan to continue to study and address the threats of climate change? And, maybe a more difficult question, how will you make sure that what appears to be glaring omissions of the term climate change don't yield a subtext in which NOAA's internal culture that science, conservation, and management of natural resources are not valued, or worse, should be censored in this administration?
Thank you for your question, Senator Baldwin. As Secretary Ross and I stated publicly after the document hit the press, was that we are committed to NOAA's climate and conservation elements of our mission. And you can see today in FY18, we have $100 million dedicated, or nearly so, to climate research. And we're continuing to perform climate services through our Climate Program Office and Climate Prediction Center. So we are committed to continuing that element of our mission.
Senator Nelson.
Admiral, you retired from the Navy as the chief oceanographer of the Navy, is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And what is that? Is that Rear Admiral?
I was a Rear Admiral when I retired, yes, sir.
2-star.
I was a 1-star, sir.
Well, your long and distinguished record is certainly admirable, and we appreciate it. And personally, I'm very glad with your background that you are where you are. Now, you answered the question of the chairman's about fishing research when he asked about a 17% cut. You answered it, we are committed to fishing research, but we think we can be more efficient. When Senator Baldwin asked you about climate change and the lack of use of the term climate change, you basically answered that we are committed to studying the climate, and yet the president's budget has a $50 million cut in climate change research. How do you square that?
In the president's budget, Senator, of course, we had to make tough priority calls, and the president elected to prioritize national security funding, and that therefore Commerce and NOAA saw reduced levels in the proposed budget. I will answer to you, though, that we're committed to our climate support and research and advancement through the subseasonal to seasonal forecasting capability or element of it that's called out in the Weather Act.
Well, you just answered that the priorities of national security sometimes trump the other parts of the budget. The specific question here is about climate change, and you are a retired Navy admiral. Does the effects of climate change have any effects on national security?
Senator, yes, sir. I saw that in my career, and I've spoken about the effects of climate change on national security. And in fact, though, I would say, though, that there are many interagency efforts to assess those impacts. And therefore, again, I don't believe that reductions in funding towards that in NOAA are significant in that. The Navy is also committed to studying climate and climate effects on national security, as is the Department of Energy, as is NASA.
I appreciate that, and I'm not going to throw you softballs. I'm going to throw you harder pitches. Give me an example of where climate change would have a direct impact on the United States military with regard to our national security.
I think the thing that I saw that was most obvious was the effects of sea level rise in Norfolk Naval Station, for example, which is experiencing increased levels of high tide flooding, which impact the infrastructure at the base, the airfields, and the piers, and just the accessibility by the sailors to get to their work every day.
Well, with that, I'm going to back off the hardballs because I think you've answered the question about why it ought to be all hands on deck, to use a Navy term, about the issue of climate change. Not just the U.S. military, but the very agency that is tasked with studying the climate, and that's your agency, NOAA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.